I am Count Tattula, and I bid you welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will. Seeing as though you are here, how about we go and draw some blood? British weather, I hate flying in the rain. But we're here now, let's do the stencil. Okay, now we're gonna line up the stencil using a blood red Sharpie. Never mind. Okay, let's see what we can do. Okay, that should be enough for now. Yeah, I've used a lot of stencil fluids over the years. Always end up swapping to something else because they're just never quite what I wanted it to be. Recently discovered this Proton stuff, and shameless plug, it's incredible. I've literally never had any kind of stencil fluids that have held on as well as this one. So let's see how it goes. So now I'm just lining it up to the little marks that I made earlier. And then just pressing it on one side at a time. I've seen a few artists, they always try and put the whole thing on in one go, but you can end up like losing patches or like the paper creases and it doesn't sit quite right. So I have a lot of success with just doing my stencils one side at a time. Now for the peel reveal. Beautiful, look at that. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of all the equipment I'm going to use for this tattoo today. So first of all, we've got the machine, which is the FK Irons Flux Max, which I've been using for a while now, and I'm absolutely in love with it. Quadrant cartridges, which in my opinion are the best on the market. Dynamic black ink, which I've been using for over a decade, and it's never steered me wrong. I'll be wiping everything down with Hustle Butter Hustle Foam. I put the stencil on with Proton stencil stuff, and I think that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to get my teeth sunk into this tattoo. Okay, so we're going to get started now anyway. So I want the outline for most of this to be quite thick, but not too thick, so I'm going with a 9 liner for this. And we're just going to build it up nice and slow, starting with the coffin at the back. So for any of the bigger liners, I tend to run the Flux Max at around 8 volts. It seems to be like the most consistent for driving in like bigger needle groupings. And for anything smaller, I usually drop it down to like 7, 6.5, something like that. But I do like to change as I go, just depending on like the customer's skin and the design and whatever techniques I'm using and all that kind of stuff. I've always liked the look of tattoos with like a bolder outline, but then finer detail on the inside. So that's pretty much what I do for most of my pieces these days. And so because I'm trying to build up a nice wood texture on the coffin, a lot of these lines, I'm not trying to put in like perfectly crisp, clean lines. I'm just letting the edges kind of wobble a little bit and stuff like that, because once it's shaded, it just looks like old, aged wood. So the cartridges that I'm using for this piece, and well, pretty much every piece that I do, are quadrant cartridges. I've had a shop around the market. I've tried a bunch of different cartridges over the years, but these ones just seem to be an absolute home run. Like the needle groupings are always like perfect. The needles are polished. It's just so smooth when it goes into the skin. I get a lot of stick online every now and then for when I don't use like Vaseline or Hustle Butter or anything on the skin when I'm tattooing. But with needles this like polished and well made, you don't need to. They are like precision. They will go into the skin and cause minimal damage. That's what they're designed to do. Whenever I'm tattooing legs as well, I always like to put like a pillow underneath. It's more comfortable for the customer, but also it kind of pushes the skin around more and like just pushes the stencil out. So it's like everything is a bit cleaner. It's a lot easier to stretch the skin and stuff like that. So in the last tutorial I did for Killer Ink, I mentioned that like I don't focus on having like super crisp, clean lines for my work. And a lot of people do disagree, and I completely understand. Like, you know, your line work is supposed to be your bread and butter for a tattoo artist. But for me personally, like for my style, that's it. I just like the look of like incomplete, dotty, messy, textured lines. It just adds really nicely to my style. And because I know I'm gonna go in and do a lot of like shading and details and stuff like that, you're gonna lose a lot of the line work. You're not gonna see it in the final piece anyway. So for me, it's not the most important thing in the world. Now, I'm not saying that that is across the board in tattooing. I'm not saying don't worry about your lines. You really should, but your style does have a lot to do with it. If you're an old school artist, obviously crisp, clean, bold lines is your thing. But because I do illustrative black work, it's fine. Like messy lines add to the vibe. That's what it's all about. I spent years perfecting crispy, clean lines and stuff like that. It's not that I can't do it. It's just I prefer how messy line work looks. It's just my taste. That's all. But if you're new to the industry or you're early on in your apprenticeship, I still recommend learning how to line as clean as you possibly can. It's a necessary thing to learn in the beginning, and then if, like me, you choose later on down the line to veer away from it and do your own thing, that's fine. But get your fundamentals in first, people. So one thing I found is when you fill the tip of your cartridge with ink, a lot of the time, as soon as you put it on the skin, it explodes everywhere. So me personally, I just dip it, give it a little shake on some kitchen roll, that gets rid of the excess, and then I come back, tattoo, and it's much cleaner, much easier to work with. You do kind of have to go back and dip a bit more frequently, but again, it just makes sense to me. So another thing that is worth bringing up is when I'm wiping a tattoo, again, on camera, it can look very aggressive. I know in my last tutorial, there was a lot of comments of people saying like, oh my God, why is he dry wiping us so rough and stuff like that? I'm not. The tissue is very well saturated. I make sure I'm doing it nice and light. It's just for some reason, it looks super brutal on camera, and that's out of my control. But I tattoo a lot of people. I've tattooed a lot of people over the years, and no one's ever really complained that the wiping is hurting. So I think we're good. But once the skin does start to look a bit red and irritated, like a few hours into a tattoo, that's when I'll start to use like hustle foam or some kind of other product that's gonna add a little bit more to the kitchen roll other than just the water and green soap, so it will soothe the skin as I'm wiping. But we'll get to that a little later. I do try to avoid dry wiping as much as I possibly can though. The only time I ever dry wipe is like right at the very end, when I've gave it a good clean and I'm about to take some pictures or videos of the piece. Just because if you leave any liquid on the skin, it's gonna like reflect in the light and it's gonna look awful on camera. So sometimes dry wipes at the end is a bit of a necessary evil, but not during the tattoo. Come on, be kind. One of the hardest parts about being a vampire and a tattoo artist is the self-control when you're around blood all day, every day. But it's been a few years now, and I'm getting much better at my self-control. I haven't killed anyone in like 3 years. That's a customer anyway. Like this wasn't a customer. Like I cut myself shaving for the video. So with the quadrant cartridges, I like to buy the long taper ones, just because I think it just gives you a bit more freedom with your line weights and stuff like that. I've used normal taper and stuff in the past, obviously, but I think if you are trying to get a nice, crisp, consistent line, you're probably better using a more like smaller, shorter taper. But with the extra long, that's for the style that I'm trying to go for, like the messy line work and the crazy texture, it's just perfect. It's so like versatile. You can get details in that'll hold up without going too deep. So every artist is unique. in their techniques and stuff like that. You just kind of develop it over the years of what's comfortable and what works for you. So I know a lot of artists like to do, they'll put the needle into the skin and they'll pull their arm to get a nice crisp line. But again, because that's not really what I'm going for, I've kind of like trained myself to mainly just use my fingers. So I've got a lot of articulation there. So any kind of like small details and stuff, I've got a lot of control. Okay, so we're coming up to the top of the leg now. So with this being quite close to like the knee ditch, the skin here can be a lot more sensitive. So I always just ease up a little bit with the first few lines. I don't dive straight in with the same weight I was doing lower down on the thicker skin. Just because that's it, people's skin changes millimeter to millimeter. You can't really use one technique for the whole thing. You do have to mix it up as you go. And like I've said before, it's better to go in too light and then correct your mistake than go in too deep and just blow out and there's nothing you can do. Like with other styles of tattooing, you kind of do need to nail it out the gate. It has to be perfect. The first line you pull has to be in and solid and straight. But again, for this kind of like illustrative black work, you can kind of dabble in just a little bit of experimentation, and if it doesn't quite work, go back in and correct your mistake. You just got to be careful to not overwork the skin. Don't go over the area again and again and again. Just kind of do your test line, and then if it's not quite right, nail it on the next go. You don't want to do more than 2 passes on any line work, or you do run the risk of chewing up the skin. So my favorite thing about using cartridges is just how easy you can swap needle sizes. So I've gone down from a 9 to a 7 now. So I'm going to drop the voltage a little bit, just to 7.5, just so it's not hitting quite as hard. And we can just go in and start getting some of the smaller line work details done on the coffin side of things. Like back in the day, you used to have an entire different machine set up if you wanted to like swap during the tattoo. Or you just have to do one line weight consistently over the whole piece, then swap it all over, and then go in and do the smaller lines. But cartridges really did change the game for stuff like that. You can just change as you go, nice and easy, pop it in, pop it out, done. And I don't think I could ever go back. I could try, but I'd be miserable. So this piece in particular, it's based on a friend of mine. He was like half vampire, half demon, and he was actually killed by none other than Buffy, the vampire slayer. The hatred I have for that woman, you have no idea. Don't get me started. But I wanted to do a piece based on his skull, because I used to own it. It was in my church, my crypt. But a friend of mine stole it, so I decided to do this piece today in honor of his memory. So it might seem a bit weird, the concept of a vampire using Procreate, but it's the best design tool for tattoo artists at the minute. It makes life so much easier. You can try out a bunch of different things without having to commit to paper. Okay, so we're moving on to the horn now. So I've swapped back to the 9 liner, and then that's back up to 8 volts. And whenever I'm doing anything with like ram horns or like ram skulls and stuff like that, when I'm outlining the outside, I like to just let my hand wave back and forward in like a little wavy, zigzaggy motion. Just because it creates a really nice like texture, which is what a lot of the ram horns look like. And once that outline's in, I can kind of follow each of these little waves when I'm putting the lines in for the detail. So because of where I'm tattooing now, there's quite like a prominent bone. You can feel it like really close to the surface. So again, any kind of like bone sticking out, it's more of a risk of blowout if you run too deep. So I always just like to go in a little bit lighter than I have been. And like I say, if it's not quite heavy enough, I can just go back and do it. So I've swapped over to a 3-liner now, just to get some of the smaller details in on the coffin. So I'm running that at 7 volts, just so it's, again, not quite as heavy hitting as it was before, but it'll still get everything in nice and clean. It's always best to err on the side of caution and just run smaller needle groupings at a much lower voltage at first. Because one of the biggest causes of blowout is just the machine basically running the ink too much in one spot. So the higher the voltage, the more likely that's going to happen. So it's best to just start slow and steady and then build it up if you think you need to. Because like I say, you can always correct, you can't undo. I'm not really overthinking these scratches, I'm just kind of letting my brain just go into autopilot with them and just putting it wherever I think it's going to look cool. Because I'm going to go in with a wood grain texture over all of this later, so this is just for a little bit of extra aesthetic. So all of these horns are basically going to be built up with loads of different lines to build up the texture and the shading and stuff. So these first guidelines that I'm getting in now, again, I'm not lingering on the skin too long, so I'm trying to avoid blowout. But I'm also not worrying about if they're like absolutely perfect or not, because there's going to be that many lines eventually in like dark shading. You're not going to see these. They're just kind of placeholders. So that's all of the coffin lines done. So I'm just going to give it a little wipe down with a little bit of Hustle foam just to help soothe the skin. Plus the amazing smell of Hustle Butter products hides the blood very well. So helps with the whole self-control thing. So I'm just going to finish off the line work on the horns before moving on to the skull itself. And like I mentioned before, if there is any areas where there's like quite a prominent bone close to the skin, I'll always try and just like stretch the skin away from it if I can, just again, to avoid that blowout scenario. So for this little section of the skull, I am kind of just making it up as I go along. In the beginning, it's much easier and better to have like an actual set idea in your mind of how you want it to look, like a full finished design ready to go. But for me personally, I do just enjoy being able to look at a tattoo and be like, ah, this idea will be really cool, and then just do it in the moment and be able to trust myself that it'll work out. It makes things a lot more fun, because if I had just a complete finished design ready to go, it would just feel like I'm kind of copy and pasting, and there's like no joy in that. The whole thing about art is just to have that artistic freedom to do your own thing. And so even though I am marking people for the rest of their life, I do still try and do my own thing. As long as the customer's okay with it, of course. Okay, so I'm finished with all of the base outline now, so we get to move on to the fun part, which is the texture. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is get some of like the bigger, darker black areas in. So for that, I'm going to use a 9-round shader, which I'm going to run at 7 volts, just so it's not hitting too fast. I can still build up some nice textures with it. Obviously, the higher you run it, the more solid the color's going to be. So for packing colors, you want it nice and fast. But I want to get, like I say, get it as textured as I possibly can. So I'm going to run it at 7 and just do a nice little zigzag motion back and forward to build up a gradient. So starting in the corner, obviously the zigzags are much tighter because you want that to be the darker area. And then as I get further out, I just take the zigzags a little bit wider, leave a bit of a bigger gap in between each one. And when you use a round shader, you get this really nice like dotty texture. So for my kind of style, it's perfect. Just going back in and darkening up the gradient a little bit. But bearing in mind to try and not overwork the skin. You don't want to just keep going over and over and over the same area with it, because you will. You'll chew up the skin, it'll scar more, it'll heal worse. And it's more touch-ups in the future. So I'm quite happy with how that gradient's looking, so I'll come back in with a 3-liner a little bit later and just do some little whips out, just to give it more of like a dotty texture and a more interesting finish. So it's got a couple of little solid black panels to do here, so I really like using round shaders for that, just because you can get in a lot easier than you can with like a bigger, straighter mag. And it usually packs the black in a bit deeper in the first pass, so you're not overworking the skin too much. I am fairly new to using round shaders. I kind of used to do all of my stuff with liners, but recently gave some round shaders a go, and I was like, oh, okay, so they can create their own texture, something completely different than liners can do. And if you are trying to pack little areas of black with a liner, it will do a little bit more damage to the skin, so these guys are the way forward. And so same again for this little panel here. I'm gonna start a gradient at each edge, because the goal is I want the outside of this to be as dark as possible, but the middle can be a little bit lighter, a bit more textured, my favorite word. So I'm just doing a little bit of whip shading, because by using whip shading, I now know where I start the needle is going to be darker and where it ends is going to be lighter. So for the gradients I'm trying to create, that's the best technique. So same again on the other side. Little zigzag motion to get the first bit of black in, and then whip out from there. When it comes to whip shading, if you whip back on yourself, it's always going to be a lot lighter, and if you whip forward, it's going to be darker. And it's just because you're pushing the needle like directly into the skin if you do it forward, whereas like you're pulling the pins backwards if you're pulling it back on yourself. So especially if you're trying to build up like softer grey tones but only using black ink, it's best to whip backwards, because it's definitely going to hit a lot softer and you can build it up a bit more without damaging the skin. So I'm happy with that for now. But like I said with this area, I'm going to go back in with a 3-liner a little bit later and just add some extra dots, extra textures and work it that way. So for this panel, I do want it to be pretty much solid black, so I'm going to stick to just a very small, tight zigzag motion. Less of a gap between strokes. Same again for this top panel, just nice, tight, close movements, just to make sure this part's going to be blacker than the rest. But it's always good to experiment. It doesn't matter what level you're at in your career or how many years you've been doing it. If there's a product or a needle grouping or something that you've never used before, give it a go. You never know, like it might be the thing you were looking for, something that you were missing the whole time, but you ended up stuck in your ways and you never tried anything new. I've been there, it's not great. So now I'll swap back over to the 3-round liner, and I'm running this at 6.5 volts. Because basically, when you're doing whip shading with a small liner, the faster you run it, the closer together the dots are going to be in the whips. The slower you run it, the bigger the gap. So for building up texture, you want the gap to be quite big, so you can just do it like again and again to build up tones. So just doing a couple of little whips out, just to kind of test that I'm happy with how it looks. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So now I'm going to start whipping lower than the gradient that I shaded before, just to start bringing the texture into the rest of this bone here. And then now I'm just going in and just doing a few little dots. Because I kind of do, when I do whip shading, I don't really follow one direction. It is a little bit like omnidirectional. So it means you always end up with like little gaps that you need to fill. So you can just go in and dot them in manually. For some pieces, I do just one direction whip shading, just so it looks a bit cleaner. But for stuff like this, I'm just trying to make it as textured as possible, so I come from every angle. So I'm just building up some contour shading with some whips here, which again, slow and steady wins the race. Same with the eye. I'm just adding like a little bit of whip shading coming down from the top just to create the shadow. And then I'll go back in with a single needle a little bit later just to add more lines, which is like more my classic style. But with a single needle being so small, you don't want to try and build up shadows and shit with it. Can I say shit? I'm going to do a little bit of whip shading underneath the cheekbone now as well, just to create a little shadow before I go back in and detail it later. It's always good to get your darker tones and your black panels in first, just because you could end up spending hours doing detail on a whole area and then you just end up shading over it anyway, and it's a complete waste of time. Been there, done that, learnt my lesson. Adding a little bit more contour shading onto this jawbone, and then again I'll go back with a single needle later just to add all like the little meticulous details that I like to do. Just gonna add a little spontaneous crack here. That wasn't in the original design, but I think it'll fill out the space nice. So for the teeth on the other side of the jaw, I'm kind of going to do a little gradient coming down from solid black and then just whipping down towards the prominent side of the jaw. So it'll kind of create like a little glow around the front facing part of the jaw, which it's something I like to do a lot. Instead of just like doing a silhouette for background parts, just give it a little gradient. It just makes it look a bit more like visually interesting. And so I can do all of that with a 3-liner. I'm just again whipping towards me so it's a little bit softer and I can build it up slowly. And then same as before, any little gaps that are left by the whips, I can just go in and manually dot it just to make it look a bit more uniform. So same again with this little background tooth here. I'm going to start pretty solid at the bottom, little zigzags, and then slowly whip it out at the end to create that gradient. Then a bit of whip shading to solidify it. And then a couple of dots just to make it uniform. Sometimes whenever you're doing stuff that's like background, if it connects directly to the line work, it can just look a little bit messy and cluttered. So the gradient technique going towards the main object is my favorite way of avoiding that. Now I'm adding some little arched whips over the teeth, just to kind of create a bit more of like a 3D vibe. It doesn't look too flat. Okay, so now that most of like the bulk shading on the face is done, I've swapped back to a single needle, running that at 6 volts, so it's nice and slow. And I'm just gonna start by just etching in some little tooth details. So whenever I'm detailing teeth by pulling lines through it, I like to start the line and then I'll lift up and carry on and lift up, carry on, lift up and carry on. And just kind of dot it down at random intervals just so nothing looks too uniform. It is just very dotty and liney. Because I have found if you overthink where the details are going to go with stuff like that, sometimes you do just make it look too uniform. So it's best to just kind of like let the needle do its thing. And then I'm just going to add a couple of little dots just to fill out some areas. And a little bit of whip shading from the bottom and the side just to create a small shadow. And so for the other teeth, I always tend to like do a little arch just below the root. And that's just to signify when that will have been underneath the gum, it will have been like a darker color than the tooth that's exposed. And then just add a bunch of little single needle whips just to kind of pack that out with some subtle shading. I'll then go in and add a few little cracks and dots just to texture them up. It's almost unheard of that you're going to find an animal tooth that's like in perfect condition, so feel free to just gnarl them up as much as you can. So another little set of bouncy lines for the bottom tooth. As most people probably know, there wouldn't be this much root exposed on the tooth if it's actually in the skull. But again, it's another thing that I like to do, where you remove the reality to make way for the creativity. It doesn't have to make perfect sense, it can just look good. Okay, so now we're going to incorporate my classic Whippy Circles technique into this design. If you want to learn a bit more about it, I talk more in depth in the last tutorial I did with Killer Ink, which should be linked here somewhere. So go and check that out. But for now, we're just gonna whip a single needle around in little circles and just get a nice little bunch of them together. So recently, I actually had a little scroll through all of my old pictures and stuff on Instagram to try and work out when I started doing the whole Whippy Circle thing, but I just couldn't really find it. It was just something that I started adding small circles to designs. I was doing a lot of nautical stuff, so octopuses and things like that. Octopi? Either way. I'd draw just little circles and then I'd tattoo them as full circles. But once I'd seen them healed, the lines were all too close together. It just looked a bit messy because it was just heavy line work, loads of circles next to each other. And at that time, I'd already started working on whip shading and stuff. So it just kind of seemed like a logical move to just whip the circles because it's less deep ink into the skin, but the exact same texture. And once I'd kind of perfected it, that was it. I just put it into everything. Everything that I could get away with putting Whippy Circles in, I put Whippy Circles in. And I still do that to this day. Even designs that have no call for Whippy Circles at all get the Whippy Circle treatment. Now, when you're doing this technique on skin, it's quite similar to with grey wash, where you'll see the redness kind of showing through more than the ink. So it can look a bit brutal at first, but just trust the process. It'll settle back in, and once it's healed, it's all gonna look fine. It's just because the needle is so small, so the marks that it's leaving allow the blood to show through. But they don't have to be perfect circles. They don't have to be complete circles. It's just the texture that I'm trying to achieve, not the circles themselves. So just nice little quick whips and move on. I'll then go in and just add a few little dots on the inside of most of the circles, just to pad it out a bit more. And then I'm going to add a few more on the cheekbone, just to fill out this whole area. So I'll do some really big ones in the middle, and then just loads of little ones on the outside. I'm also going to add some at the bottom of the jawbone, just because I like how it looks. I just think it's a really nice way of filling out big areas with loads of little textures, but without having to like overthink it. You can just let the geometry do its thing. And lastly, I'm just gonna add a few here at the front. I'm not gonna do the entire area, I'm just gonna do like a few little clusters of them. Just to keep the theme going, but without overdoing it. So I'll just jump around into different areas as I'm going. Again, trying to keep it natural and not overthink the placement too much. Now I'm just adding a bunch of thin little lines to the nose bone, just to kind of make it look like little hairline cracks and stuff. And so again, whenever I'm doing this, I try to not go too deep. I'll try and let some lines like not be the full depth it's supposed to be. And that's just because if I was to do every single line full depth, eventually it would just bleed together and it'd just be a big black blob. Whereas by doing this technique, some of the lines will fall out, some of them won't spread as much. So once it's healed, you'll have like a really nice, satisfying, liney texture, but it'll stand the test of time. And like I've said before, absolute worst case scenario, it just falls out, in which case you just do it again. It's better than blowing out. Okay, so now I'm going to add a load of wood grain texture to the coffin. There's no real rhyme or reason to the way I do wood grain. It's just nice wavy patterns that look nice. So I never really need to plan it. I practiced a lot years ago, like I'd spend ages drawing it over and over again until it looked the way I wanted. But once you've kind of done that, you could then just tattoo it and know it's going to look the way you want it to look. So I'll always start by adding just like a little S kind of wave down one panel. And then from there, I can just add a little bubble. And another line on the outside. So that has already started the wood grain. And then I'll just do another couple of rings, because that's how trees work. And again, I'm not putting these in too deep because I'm going to go in with a single needle afterwards and add even thinner rings around it, so I don't want it to blur too much together over time. And yeah, I just try and make like some of the shapes really unique so it's not the same every time. Similar to the other stuff I did earlier, it's not about getting the lines in, it is just about the texture. So I don't need to worry too much about like the gaps between every line being like perfectly even or anything like that. Just as long as by the end there's a lot of lines that look like wood, job done. And so I kind of utilize the whole pulling the needle out halfway through the line thing that I was talking about earlier, just to create like a jumpier line so it's less consistent. Some parts do end up looking more like a topographical map than wood grain, but again, it's fine. If you like the way it looks and it's your artwork, go for it. God, I do just keep getting the edge. I'm not gonna. I'm a professional. Okay, so swap back over to the single needle now, so drop back down to 6 volts just to make sure it's nice and soft. And I'm just going to start adding a bunch of little lines in between all of the bigger lines that I've just done. Again, these are only supposed to be like partially kind of sketched in to avoid them all bleeding together over time. And it just creates a really nice distressed wood look. You gotta remember, with Blackwork, that's the whole point, is that you only have black ink to work with. You've got no grey wash, you've got no tones, you've got no colours to build things up, so it's all about your technique and depth. And now you can start to see all of the swirliness coming together rather nicely. Just add a few little extra dots as I go, just to pad it out. Okay, so now that I've finished the bulk of the wood grain, we're going to move on to just adding a few more swirls into these 4 panels and then onto the horn. So with these panels, I'm not going to do the 3-liner first and then go in with the 1. I'm just going to do it all with the 1. And the reason for doing that is to make sure that it's all a little bit brighter than the background, just so it's contrasty. If I did the exact same texture in all of it, it would just look a little bit lost. So for these parts, because they're a little bit closer in the design, I'm just going to do them a little bit lighter and it'll all look very nice by the end. So again, with the single needle, I'm just trying to move as quick as I can on the skin so I'm not lingering in one spot for too long and risking the good old blowout. I also think it gives like a bit of a whippy texture to the lines too, so it kind of ties in with the whole vibe. So as you can see, it's the same pattern, same kind of vibe, just when it heals, a little bit more of it will fall out and it'll just look a lot lighter. You'll just get little hints of the wood grain instead of the full pattern. Yeah, I still remember the first time that I used a single needle on skin. And I think I was like 2 years out of my apprenticeship. And I love the idea that there was a needle that I could just do insanely small detail with. But I didn't predict how hard it was going to be. So like it just wobbled everywhere. All the lines were shocking. And I'll admit it was terrible. It was a bad move. But I just kind of went back to the drawing board. Because even though like at that level, I was like, oh, I'm finally tattooing, this is it. I don't have to learn anymore. I just kind of was like, all right, maybe I do. Humbled myself. And I just bought a pack of like the absolute thinnest fine liners I possibly could and just spent like the next few months just doodling and drawing and trying to pull straight lines with like a super thin marker. And then the next time I went back and tried a single needle again, I'd built that muscle memory from like the fine liners and stuff. So it helped dramatically. So no matter your level, if you've never used a single before, just go back to practicing. Just treat yourself like an apprentice again and you'll end up being able to use them pretty well. You're always learning, no matter how many years you've been doing it, there's always something you could be doing better. Okay, so I'm just going to add some little thin, grainy lines through the rest of the coffin. So again, with these ones, they don't even really need to follow the same pattern as the rest of it, because it's a completely separate part. So I'll swap back to the 3-liner. Running it at 6.5 volts just to get the last little bits of shadowing in on the side of the coffin. So again, going for that kind of like zigzag gradient and just kind of trying to create a shadow where the skull is sticking out. And then before I call it a day on the coffin, I'm just gonna add a few extra little cracks and scratches. Just because there's no such thing as too much detail and I don't care what anyone says. So that was the final nail in the coffin, okay? So we're just gonna throw some shade into the horn. Okay, so first things first, back over to the round shader at 7 volts. And I'm just gonna get the tip of the horn nice and dark. Same little zigzaggy gradient move. Just focusing on making the tip darker than the rest. And then with this black shading, I'm gonna kind of follow the inside line of the horn all the way around, which, like I've said before, could potentially go against how shadows work. But I'm not a realism artist. I'm just making it up. So for the horns, I'm pretty much doing an amalgamation of all of the techniques that I've used throughout the whole piece, just in the one area. So for the darker tones, I'm using the round shader just to get all of those blacks in nice. Then I'm going in with the 3-liner, running it a bit slower, getting some whips and texture in there, a few extra dots. And then once we finish with all that, I'll go back in with the single needle and get some nice little circle details going on as well. So I'm just whipping the 3-liner down nice, fast and steady to get a good gap between all the dots. And then, like I said earlier, just going back in and manually dotting in any little gaps that I've left. Okay, so now that I've got the bulk of the detail in the horn, I'm just going to go in now with a single needle just to add some final circle pattern textures to the edges, just to make it look a little bit different than everything else we've already done. So yeah, unlike the Whippy Circles, these are a bit more like in. I'm actually pulling like quite consistent lines with a single needle, just trying, again, not to hang up in the same area for too long. But I'm not trying to make them perfect circles as well. They're kind of like weird little warped jelly bean shapes, just to kind of look like the cracked texture of like a ram skull horn, not skull. It's getting on in the day now, you can tell. Okay, so that's a wrap for today. We do have one more session planned on this to do a little bit of background and some extra detail on the horns, but I'm happy with how that's finished. So I'm gonna let that settle for a few minutes and then we'll move on to the aftercare. Okay, so now that we've finished, I'm just going to give it a little wipe down with some green soap. And then just gently pat it dry. I try to avoid dry wiping where I can, so patting is fine. I will wipe around the edges, but that shouldn't be too painful for your customer. And then it's time to apply the second skin. So I've recently swapped to using this Recovery Derm Shield. I'm just absolutely in love with it. It's got like a matte finish, so if you put it on right, you can barely see it's even there. So there we go, you just peel off the back. Get that nice and lined up. And similarly to what I do with the stencil, I'll start in the middle, pat it on, and then just do a side at a time. Making sure to try and push out as many air bubbles as you possibly can and get it nice and flush on the skin. Which from this angle, it's not that easy. Flatten down all the edges, make sure it's nice and sealed, and then just peel off the front. Once that's all peeled off, just give it a little tap on the edges just to make sure everything's nice and secure. And then you're good to go. I usually recommend my customers leave this on for around about 3 days just to give it time to settle down. Then just pick a corner, pull it straight out and off and give it a really good rub down in the shower. Keep it nice and clean, and then once it starts to feel a bit itchy and dry, just moisturize it every day. And that's pretty much it. Okay, thanks guys. Make sure you lock the crypt on the way out. Okay. Okay, thanks guys. Make sure you lock the crypt on the way out.
Sorry. Camera speed and... Do you want to go off screen? This looks so stupid.